Hey everybody, we're going to take a look at the fuel gauge now. The fuel gauge is very similar to the temperature gauge. Got a few different components on the inside and some different points, but it's very similar. So here's the fuel gauge. I would like to point out that on both sets of these gauges I just have some blue electrical tape on the outside, and that was to tape a ground wire down while I kind of mess with these, so you can ignore that. But yeah, this thing comes apart just like the temperature gauge. Needle pops off, face pops off. You will notice some additional components on the inside, and that is a voltage regulator. It's what I believe to be one of the weak points of the whole gauge cluster design. On the back we have 3 points instead of 2 like the temperature gauge. You have S, A, and I. S is the sending unit wire from the fuel level sending unit, just like the temperature gauge has its sending wire. I is the incoming 12 volt that is supplied to this gauge. This gauge doesn't run off of 12 volts. It actually has a voltage regulator that steps that 12 volt down to 5 volt, and that's what the gauge itself runs off of. The temperature gauge also runs off 5 volts, so in order to get its 5 volts, the A point on here has a jumper wire going from the fuel gauge to the temperature gauge, providing both gauges with 5 volts. So that's what it utilizes. Just like the temperature gauge, you can look up the resistance that you should read from point to point. You should definitely do that to ensure that the gauge is good. I've checked that on this gauge, and I'm not going to demonstrate it here because it's hard to do with one hand, but as I've done so, I've noticed that my S to ground, I to ground, and A to ground do read slightly higher. I think I'm reading 63 ohms here and roughly 80 ohms on S to ground. Nonetheless, I can demonstrate that the gauge works, so even though they're reading high, I believe that the gauge is still functional. One thing that I have noticed on the gauges is when they go bad, it's due to too much heat going through the gauge. It's hard to see, but that pin actually right behind the needle melts to the plastic, and that's what stops it from moving. So if you notice that, you pop that out of place, and the gauge will typically work, but it's going to get hung up every once in a while on that. So probably need to replace the gauge if that happens. Alright, there's the fuel gauge.